We will have more formal announcements in 5 minutes. And then hopefully, Zoom is up and going. Hopefully people on Zoom, actually I could put them over on that display. I don't think anyone really was on video. Nope, they're all just hanging out. But hello to Patty Myrick. Someone in the Zoom chat, please tell me how this sounds because I've been fumbling. Thank you.
Sounds good. Sounds good.
Do you have everything you need?
I think so. We'll find out in about 15 minutes.
Sounds good. I think we'll break around an hour in or something like that.
All right.
Lee, can you let us know when it's a good time to break?
Yeah.
Bring any grab water?
Did you finish yours? Will it last a day or what? Or not even?
Till about noon the next day.
Okay.
But she ate a lot too.
Well, that's good.
Yeah, so are we going to have to pass the mic back and forth?
You could do either.
So the other one doesn't work?
We have one headset and one handheld. Both of these are presently on and muted.
You know, I'll give you the handout.
You can do the handheld because you can hold it at the same time.
Yep.
Don't do it like this, the mic.
No, we'll do that.
Love
Is
it.
this the same handheld for everything else?
Oh, yeah.
We won't need one.
I mean, if you really want. Okay.
Dennis.
Solid.
Would it be okay if I move that over the side if you get to it? Because it kind of,
Yes, I think that's fine. It's Andrew, but yeah, I think you
well, I
just
asked Andrew to move it instead of me.
I think you could pull it over. It'd be okay. It is red leaf flower.
And then 1 second, Dennis and Andrew, the mics and these speakers love each other and hate each other at the same time. Fortunately, back here, you're pretty safe. Don't try to go too adventurous like off here.
I'd fall over.
Yeah, well,
What
yeah.
about for announcements? Do you want them to come up here?
The announcer is yeah. Okay, this is a good mark. Oh, hello.
Do I need to turn my mic off when you're talking?
I don't think so. But
Yeah.
how to use it.
So
He asked if he needs to turn it off.
no, fortunately they can coexist. So
Okay.
the easy thing is that orientation. You can fiddle with it to try to not like be so breathy. And then send that down your net on.
Or just go over the head, from back of the head.
Yeah, over the head. They'll just loosely get it. You fine tune it.
If it's in color.
You might bring that down and then pull this out there, somewhere like that. This we can leave out or go down the shirt, either way.
Let's do out.
And I'll let
Right
you
here.
there.
Could you please look at the
And then,
plastic?
see the orange button with the orange light? Say something.
I'm live.
There you go.
Oh, I remember it.
Well, there were people like
dated myself there.
And then
You're finally in.
All right, 3 minutes still.
I'm gonna look a little pad about that. And then to get back in the United States, there's a part A, the attestation of the United States. Do you want me to send you an email with the link in it? You can just send the link. Okay, that's, okay. 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 It's 12 hours before flight check, and they won't let you open it unless it's. Yes. The 30th. That's Sunday. I'll look at it.
I suppose I could do my own announcement about needing volunteers. Makes sense.
We'll just get a cabin. This time I'm not going to do it.
Yeah.
All right, welcome everybody. We're going to get our formal meeting started. Before we take off with the presentation, I have a few announcements, and my first two announcements are from other people. So I'm going to have Lee Cheadle come up and get us started with a quick announcement.
All right, thank you very much.
There we go. That's better. Now you can recognize me. So I was shocked when I found out a month or so ago that we actually have 500 members now. Wow. That's just incredible. Just incredible. Anyway, having 500 members means we don't always know everybody, right? I mean, we mill around, we introduce ourselves. But we have two special members that I want to talk about, okay? And we've lost one recently. And that was twin brothers, Bob and Bill Knopp. And Bill Knopp passed away a couple of years ago from cancer. They gave him 6 months and they were right. And so we lost him. But I want to talk a little bit about what he accomplished with us and helped us with as a club, and Bob continues to do so with his with Bill's wife, who supports the Bonsai Society also. So the mentorship program has always been the thing that holds this the new people to this club and gets them introduced and helps them to stay. Well, Bill donated and let us have access to an acre of potted pre-bonsai trees. And we thought the mentorship would be 20 people, but it was 40 people that year, every month. So that we had to have 20 classes. Didn't flinch. Let us have every single tree we needed. I did some quick math this afternoon, and it was between $4,000 and $5,000 worth of trees they donated to this club so our mentorship program could continue to grow. And those that were here for that mentorship program, those 40 people, will remember the quality of those trees that year. In addition, Bill's wife and Bob decided, I guess that wasn't enough. And so when they had their sale this year at Colony Nursery, they donated a 20% of their sales, and another $5,000 came our way. So that's the kind of person that Bill was. But Bob is still with us, is still a member. And so I just wanted us to, everybody here to know and remember the greatness of Bill Knopp and what he did for this Bonsai Club. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Lee, for sharing that with us. We have some announcements about the silent auction, and I'll have Brandon, our club treasurer, give those.
Thank you. Good evening, everybody. I want to announce an addition to our plan tonight, which is during the second half of the presentation, we'll be opening up for payments via check and via Venmo. So when the announcement comes, up to 2 members at a time can come over, collect their win slips, and we have Venmo placards over here. You can make a check out to BSOP, and that way you can pay and you don't have to wait in line at the end of the meeting. For those of you that are not comfortable with check or Venmo, we will still have a payment period after the presentation is complete, where we will also take credit card. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Brandon. I have a few more club announcements. We need volunteers to keep our organization going. And so we just recently had a board member step down, Brandon Myron, our secretary, for some personal reasons. And so we're looking for a new secretary. And then we also need a few other committee chairs. We need an assistant programs helper for Reed. We need a club ambassador, a raffle committee head, and a few other volunteers. What we do is we have a sign-up table in the back. It's a round table. If you're interested in helping the administrative duties of the club or helping with these programs, we'd really appreciate it. If you just put your name down, and we'll contact you about that. Reed, did you? Yeah, if you find a board member and we have these kind of neon green tags, then we can help describe that a little bit more in detail if you have some questions. So.
As convincing as I might look doing AV and program stuff, I am an introvert who writes software for a living. So this is not at all my bread and butter, but my gosh, I can sweat while doing it. Please join. I will reach out to people individually. I'll pick on you. I'm sorry. I'm going to follow up with you. That is my beg and plead. Thank you.
All right. And lastly, I just want to thank everybody for being here. We are doing some new protocols in place just to keep everybody safe, so thanks for cooperating with us on that. Going along with that, I appreciate that everybody has a mask on. We'll do the same thing that flights are doing. Make sure it's covering your nose. If you need to take a sip of water or something, you can take your mask off. Just make sure you put it back on afterwards. We appreciate your help with that. And lastly, I just want to welcome you all. It's fun to be here in person, inside again. Do we have any new members here? Any new members, if you want to raise your hand? All right. If you look all around you, 360 degrees, this club is full of people that want to help you with bonsai. And so if you have any questions, please feel free to reach out to them. They want to help you with your bonsai journey. And thank you for joining. We're going to get started with a presentation. I'm Andrew Robson, the club president, and I have with me my good friend Dennis Vojtilla. We're both deciduous bonsai gurus and very passionate about deciduous plants. And so for the meeting this month, it's about deciduous bonsai, and we just wanted to kick it off sharing this wonderful part of bonsai. This is the best time of year for deciduous because they're in color, they're showing off, and the leaves drop, and all the excitement of building a bonsai happens when we can see this beautiful branch structure. So we're going to talk all about deciduous bonsai tonight. I'm going to hand it over to Dennis. He's going to talk about his plum that he has and what he's going to be doing with that. And then I'll get started on some other things. So, Dennis, welcome.
Hello, hello. Can you hear me okay? And then maybe. Say hello again. All right. Welcome back. Are you guys excited about being here? right, so I should introduce my tree. Sure. So many of you have seen this tree once or twice before. I attempted, I think last time I was here, to wire the tree as part of the demonstration. Well, I just finished wiring most of the tree and it took me 12 hours. So I decided not to wire the tree during a demonstration because you already seen that part. You didn't get to see me actually move the branches, shape them, and position them. So that's what I'm going to do today. History of the tree more.
Yeah, tell us about your tree. How long have you had it?
Okay, so
where did it come from?
this is a red leaf plum, Prunus ceracifera. It was nursery stock that I got probably 30 years ago. So the tree itself is, let's say, 45 years old, thereabouts. When I got it, it was probably 1 inch in diameter at the trunk. Now it's a little bit bigger. Let's see what else. It has been in the national exhibition, I think the second national exhibition. And then shortly thereafter, it came down with shot hole fungus. Shot hole fungus. It looks like someone hits the leaves with a BB gun. It leaves little round or oval holes in the leaves. And you can kind of see the effects on it in this section over here, where there aren't any branches. This one, this one, this one, part of this one back here, this one also. So it almost died. That must have been about 4 or 5 years ago. And so what I've been doing is working it back to health. You can see that it is very loud all of a sudden.
No, that was me.
Okay. It is a lot healthier. You can tell by the extended growth here. So this past year, I did what I rarely advise people to do, and that is I let the tree grow. Now, somebody chuckled. There's a reason why you don't do that. And the reason is, even though you see these nice, long, luscious branches, you don't see the little ones that died. All right, so when you let the tree grow, the disadvantage is that some of the smaller twigs aren't going to get the energy that these ones did, and they'll die off on the inside. The other problem is some of these things are now more than 1/8 of an inch in diameter, just from one season of growth. So once you get to that size, it becomes more difficult to style with wiring. To bend that takes more pressure. It's more likely that you scar the tree when you do that. Now, the good news is that this tree has rough bark. And so if I screw up, as I have in a couple of places here, the tree will heal over and the rough bark will cause that scar to disappear in 5 to 6 years, which means that I'm not showing this tree for 5 to 6 years until I get rid of those scars. Anyway, downside of letting it grow with wire on is the wire bites in quicker than you can imagine. Okay.
All right. And I have with me a Trident maple. If you've been a member of the club for a while, you might recognize this tree. It's been in the club for several years for my demonstrations. It's a Trident maple. About 3 years ago, I brought it in the summer and did a major cutback on it. I cut off almost every branch on the tree back to the trunk, and so I've been growing it a little bit more deliberately in the style that I want. And so it's coming along. It's been, like I said, this is maybe the 3rd or 4th time that I've brought it back, so we can, for those who recognize it, you can see how it's progressing. And I'm going to work on this tonight. So I have this and a few other trees that have pretty contrasting work. With deciduous bonsai, and really with all bonsai, we can only do 3 things. There's only 3 things that you can do in bonsai. The first is you can do nothing, meaning what Dennis did, he just let this tree grow. And that's the first thing that we can do. What that does is it causes thickness, it causes caliper. And if you have a weak tree, a tree that had fungus that needs to get healthy again, then it causes that tree to get healthy. And so the first thing that we can do in bonsai is not do anything. And there's times where it's bad. Maybe we get big internodes and large leaves, and there's times that that's good. The second thing we can do is what Dennis did on the plum is we can wire. We can redirect growth. And so we can redirect it by wrapping a spiral wire and bending the branch where we want it to go. Or we can use guy wires to pull branches that already have nice movement into place. The third thing that we can do in bonsai is we can remove growth. So I can take my pruner, I can find a branch, I can cut it off. And so there's really, if you simplify bonsai to a very, very broad scale, there's only three things we can do. We can not do anything, we can prune growth, we can remove growth, or we can redirect growth. So what Dennis is going to be doing tonight is showing you how we redirect growth to build deciduous bonsai. What I'm going to show you is how we can prune to also create deciduous bonsai as well. Now, Dennis and I agree that there are some species that make sense to do some wiring, and plum might be a good example of that. And there's some trees that make sense to do very little wiring at all, because the natural movement and genetics of the branch can cause a lot of beauty and nice lines. And so that's what I have here, trinent maple. Dennis, you don't do very much wiring on trinents, do you?
No, none in Japanese.
Right, and none on Japanese maple, he said. And the reason being, like I said, is because we can use the genetics of the branch to create nice lines. And I'll explain what that means. So with the trident,
Sorry, that's the classic sign that the battery is low.
well, we'll get that figured out. What I'm going to do on this tree is I'm basically, because this is an older bonsai, because it's a bonsai that has had several years of work put into it, I'm mostly just pruning it back to the silhouette. I've looked at this tree against a clean backdrop. That's something I also recommend is whenever you're doing deciduous bonsai or even conifer bonsai.
There we go, and talk close.
All right, it's tricky with a mask. Whenever you're doing bonsai, working against a clean backdrop is really, really helpful. And studying our trees against a clean backdrop is really, really helpful. Because bonsai, it's an art that's in 3D, you know, we see this in person, but it's also an art in 2D. When you look at bonsai on Instagram, when you look at bonsai in exhibition books or online, they have to look good both in 2D from the front and in 3D from when we're walking around in the room. And so I recommend working in both platforms. In my studio, what I do is, you know, I take a photo of the tree against a clean backdrop, I look at it on the screen, and that tells me a lot of things that I kind of miss when I'm looking at it in person in 3D. And so playing with both dimensions can really, really help us see things that we might miss when we're just limited to one. So what I'm going to do is prune this tree back to its silhouette, and then we'll go from there. Now, we have two types of plants. For broadleaf plants, which are deciduous and broadleaf evergreens, for broadleaf plants, we have two major differences. We have plants that are opposite leaf, and we have plants that are alternate leaf. Alternate leaf plants are plants like the styrax over here, where we have along the extension, we have a bud and a leaf on the left, right, and it alternates along the stem. A maple is an opposite leaf plant, so we have pairs of leaves and buds that alternate along the twig here. So with a maple, when we prune it back, I typically take it back to the first pair, and from that origin, I get two new branches that grow in its place. With something like a styrax, I'll prune it back to the second or the third pair. We never prune something like the alternate leaf plant back to the first bud, because if you always take it back to the first bud, you never gain any new ramification. Where you have one branch, you gain movement, but you don't gain any additional twigs. And so with a styrax, we always want to cut it back to the second or the third pair. I'll show you what that looks like. But I'm going to start with the maple by cutting it back to the first pair for every branch.
Andrew?
Yeah.
Did you guys remove leaves on purpose before you started, or did they naturally fall off?
Mine, can you hear me okay? Mine was 90% off, and I took the ones from like the last 3 inches of the tree and pulled them off.
Yeah, and this one also naturally fell off. And that brings up a really good point. When can we do fall work on deciduous bonsai? What's our sign? What's our time of year? And we want to see color change. If your plant is still totally green, it's probably a little bit too early to do a lot of work, unless everything else is kind of changing. The reason we want to see color change is we want that dormancy cascade to have started. Otherwise, if we prune it back, if it's too early, let's say we prune it back a month ago, in September, then we might get the tree trying to regrow and won't be able to lignify and create buds for next year. So we want to see color change. We want the leaves to just start dropping. That's the ideal time to wire, prune, trim our deciduous bonsai in the fall. If we do it too late, if I said, you know, I'm just going to sit on the couch and I'll get to this in December, and I come back and prune it, the result will still be the same, but it will bleed. I've never seen a tree die from bleeding, but bleeding can really weaken trees. And what I mean by bleeding is it will push sap out of the buds, or out of the wounds. Bleeding is great if you like maple syrup, because they're tapping maple trees in the wintertime, but those are old established trees in the ground that have lots of roots. With a bonsai, because it's in a pot, it's a little bit vulnerable. We want to reduce that type of damage as it is. So with your best trees, I recommend pruning them about a week or two after leaf drop. Some trees, like a Japanese maple, 10 days after leaf drop is kind of the window. A trident maple is about 14 days. It depends on the species, but you want to prune it right around the time that the leaves are dropping. Other questions? Yeah. Sorry, I can't quite hear you. You don't want to prune it in the middle of dormancy. If you prune this in December, January, something like that, it will probably likely push sap out of all the wounds, and that won't stop until the spring. And so the plant can lose a lot of energy, can lose sugars, so it's better to do the pruning right around now once the leaves have dropped, because we can prevent that bleeding from happening. And like I said, there's about depending on the species, there's about a 2 to 3 week window where we can prune safely and not get any bleeding.
What are the advantages in fall versus spring?
Yeah, good question. Why do we prune in the fall and not in the spring? You certainly could prune in the spring, especially after you repot a tree. But we like to prune in the fall because that reorients the buds that we're cutting back to. If we prune in the spring, the buds that we cut back to kind of have to panic and then grow from that site, and they don't have, 3, 4, 5 months to prepare. But the advantage of pruning in the fall is that you're setting those buds that you're pruning back to, you're setting those up, and they're kind of getting ready to go, so that by the time spring comes, they have a really nice kind of push. Yeah, more questions?
Can you prune and repot in the same year?
You can prune and repot. The nice thing about repotting is that it stops the bleeding from happening. So if you repot your tree first and then prune it, it won't bleed. If you prune it first, it will bleed, and then you cut the roots and that stops.
But the timing though, if you do the pruning in the fall and then repotting in the spring?
You could do that, yeah. Other question? Yeah. Yeah, so most big cuts, the best time to do that is in the summer, because when we do a really, really big cut, the response when we do it in the summer is like that. It's immediate. And so we don't have a large wound that's like in the wintertime won't be able to heal. It's just kind of a vector for disease and pathogens to get into the plant. The benefit of pruning in the summer is you get the healing and the callus started right away. So, yeah.
Well, I guess to my question, that if you were to prune in the spring, wouldn't you be creating less energy for smaller internodes? Versus doing the fall, you have more chance to build up more spring. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it makes sense, but I don't think it makes that much of a difference. I think, and I'll let Dennis chime in here a little bit too, but I always find pruning in the fall, it sets the tree up a little bit better for the spring. What do you think?
Well, the way that you prevent a big flush of growth in spring is don't feed it until after that first flush of growth. So the first flush of growth comes with last year's energy. The shoots use that and slow down, and then you feed it to push a second set of growth.
Would you guys also say that when you prune now that you're cutting off actually the strongest bud?
I do, yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, and that's the benefit, rather than, something out here, this terminal bud is gonna be really, really strong. So by pruning it in the fall, it's gonna set these buds back here that are much weaker up for success when they grow in the spring. Sometimes on a maple, or even on alternate leaf plants, that terminal bud will be dead on straight. And so it will just continue growing in the same direction. The benefit of cutting is we get a change in direction and a change in movement. Yeah.
With some trees, there's a worry about dieback and things like that, and so I've read in some places to leave like 2 sets of buds to make sure that that you don't lose the last set of bud on that. Is there certain trees that applies to, or about weak trees or strong trees?
I don't worry about that because I protect the trees from freezing during the wintertime mostly. So if you do that, you generally don't have to worry about dieback.
Is freezing the only main reason that causes dieback?
For me, it has been, that's it. I mean, to me, that's the big risk.
Yeah, and I agree with that. I think that's a good technique for certain things, but I think for pruning, it doesn't make too much of a difference. Where that technique is really powerful, where you maybe cut back, to a node more longer out, where that's more powerful is if let's say you have a Japanese maple and you're going to prune it in summer. It's a really, really strong plant. If you cut it back to that first or that second pair of buds rather than the first pair, it can have a really strong push from there, and then you go back and cut it back at the first pair later. Sorry, I'm not explaining this well. But it's a good strategy for if you have a tree that's very, very strong and you want to dampen that energy. But when I'm pruning right now, I'm always going back to the first pair. For dieback, I leave a tiny bit of a step because we do expect a little bit of dieback whenever we cut in the fall. When we cut in the spring or when we cut in the summer, we can always make flush cuts as long as they're small. But in the fall, we always want to leave just a little bit of a stub. It could be 4 or 5 millimeters, something like that. It doesn't have to be drastic, but we do want to cut them back a little bit.
Okay. So another answer to your question is, it's never wrong to do it in 2 steps. So if you cut back and leave 1 extra bud, that's not a problem, because it's real easy to cut off that sucker when you see that the one you want is really pushing. Okay? And don't cut too close to the bud. Right? Some people want to cut within a hair of the bud. Give it an 1/8 of an inch or something. You can always snip it back later. It'll die back on its own for the 1/8 of an inch.
Other questions? Yeah.
Could you differentiate a little bit about the timing of pruning? We're talking about pruning now in the fall. You also mentioned pruning in the summer.
Yeah. So timing for when we prune. This is a trident maple. It's very strong, very vigorous. We would call this a multi-flush tree, meaning it's going to push several flushes of growth a year. And that's great because with a trident maple, we can develop them very quickly. This grows maybe 4 times faster than a Japanese maple. And so trident maple bonsai, they're a lot of work, but you get a lot of return for that work. So this tree was pruned back twice during the growing season. The first time it was pruned was probably around May, something like that, maybe late June. And then the second time was late July, early August. And so it's gone through 2 rounds of cutback. What I'm cutting off now is the extension that grew since then. Again, just to recap, what I'm doing is I'm looking for where it started growing and I'm taking it back roughly to that first bud. If I have something that I want to grow out to thicken, maybe like this low branch down here, to where I'm trying to develop this lower area, I might leave this and put a wire on it, or just let it grow and develop this caliper down here on this low branch. But mostly on an old bonsai, it's relatively simple in the fall. We're just trimming it back to the silhouette. Other questions? Yeah.
With that lower branch you were talking about using to thicken up, I've got similar ones on my trident that are on like their third or fourth year, and they're like, octopus arms at this point.
Yeah, cool.
And how long is it gonna take to get a similar branch that's that size on the bottom to be as thick as one that's, pretty big?
Yeah, so I grew this branch down here in 1.5 years. 1.5 years ago, this was a sprout coming off the trunk. And so by not, by not pruning it, by letting it grow, I was able to develop some caliper and thickness, and that's my base for building off all the branches after that. So I did the same thing. I let this branch run, until it was 4, 5, 6 feet long. I cut it back. I did the same thing one other time, and so that's where it is now. So it started as a little tiny bud 1.5 years ago. Now it's about the size of my thumb.
If you had a middle branch that was way thicker, would you chop that, or would you just wait for the bottom branch to grow as thick as that one?
It kind of depends on the tree. Yeah.
The one that you're growing out doesn't look like it has many branches lower down, the littler one.
Right.
Is there anything that you're doing to make sure that you don't get too much of a space right there?
Not too much. This is going to be a relatively big sized tree, so having a larger internode, especially where it comes off the trunk, is okay. If this was a shohin, I would be really concerned about that internode being about 1.5 inches long. But I've mostly been focused on caliper rather than ramification. So I've been letting it grow, which gets it thick, but it doesn't get density. And so now that it's starting to get thick, because this is the lowest branch on the tree, I want this to be the thickest branch on the tree. So now that it's starting to get thick, I'll start cutting it back more and more, and it will start to create more refinement.
The one next to it, the thinner one that you're just starting, that first branch seems really, really far out. Is it gonna bud farther in at any point, or?
Yeah, so on this tree, I have an internode here, here, and here. So I won't ever get anything budding in the center unless I third ground.
I'm talking about this one. So is this gonna ever bud back here, or is this gonna be your first branch?
No, this will bud back. I have internodes back in there.
That's what I was looking.
I'll probably let this grow until it's the same thickness as this.
But there is theoretically back buds to be had in there when you go.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, that's what I was.
Yeah, because as this grows, I get all these pairs of leaves that come off of that. Yeah.
So you're talking about pruning. What if you have a sacrifice branch that's rather thick? How quickly would you let that get before you prune it? Is this a good time of year to do that? Is there a reason that you might wait to do that later?
Yeah.
Because you were talking about making big cuts in the summer.
Yep.
What about a sacrifice?
Yeah, I typically don't do those cuts unless it's the summertime. And so the reason that we can let these extend is again, to develop that thickness and that caliper. And I don't want to mess with that unless I want a response. And so in the summertime, if I prune it back, I'm going to get buds immediately that start growing. If I prune it back in the fall, I can still get buds, but they won't grow until next year. But typically, I'm cutting sacrifice branches in the summer whenever I need to prune them. I missed the second part. What was the second part?
The second part is, I'd like to hear Dennis's answer to that too, but is there I have a rule of thumb for myself about how big I'll let sacrifice branches get. Depending on the species of it, before I prune them, so I don't get a scar that I can't heal.
Oh, my turn, huh? I don't use sacrifice branches all that much. So I tend not to let them get bigger than, let's say, 3/8 of an inch. So I like to keep them fairly small. I've cut on some trees that I've gotten, you could tell where somebody let them run as probably sacrifice branches at one time, and so they're now 3/4 of an inch thick or something like that. And mostly they just have to be chopped off. And the bigger it is, the more scar it leaves, the longer time it takes to heal that scar. And sometimes, like if you do it on a Chinese quince, I've been waiting for 20-some years on one of them to close up. Chinese quince just doesn't heal very quickly. Something like a trident maple could heal in 2 seasons, or Japanese maple. But depending upon the nature of the tree, a ginkgo, I'm not even sure a ginkgo ever heals from a scar that's any size. So I tend to make smaller sacrifice branches if I use them. And I may do it multiple times in different parts of the tree if I still need to increase the energy of the tree. Okay.
Yeah, and Scott, I do it, I use sacrifice branches a little bit more than Dennis in my practice. But again, for me, it depends on the species, just like Dennis says. Trident maple, you can heal a scar and it can become invisible. A Japanese maple, you can heal a scar and you're gonna see it for 25 years. So if it's a trident maple, I'm okay with a bigger scar. With a Japanese maple, I want a smaller one. Beech is the same way as Japanese maple. Chinese quince is hard to heal, ginkgo. But trees like a Stewartia, or things that tend to have more exfoliating bark, they tend to hide the scars really, really well. And so you can have those cuts be a little bit bigger. It also depends where it is on the plant a little bit too. And if it's on the back, I might give it more, let it grow a little bit bigger than if it's on the front. This tree here has several spots where it had big chops. There's one right here. There's one right here. There's probably another one down below that we can't see anymore. But they do become, near invisible. Other questions? So I'm about done on this one. I'm going to leave these 2 branches on this, or these 2 secondary branches on this lowest branch alone because I want those to thicken. I might take this time to put a wire on them and put a little bit of movement, but I'm going to let something like this grow out until it's 6 feet long or so, and then I'm going to cut it back somewhere into here. The rest of the tree, I'm going to do something else. I'm going to keep it kind of refined. There's still a few areas that are maybe a little thick, a little heavy, something like this. So I'll cut some of the heaviness out now that I've cut it back to the silhouette. But this tree's mostly done. Older bonsai in the fall tends to be less exciting with its fall work. I'm going to move on to the styrax, and that's going to be pretty drastic in terms of how it gets cut back.
Shall I speak?
One question for you, Andrew.
Yeah.
Can you kind of just approximate where you see the final silhouette at?
Yeah, so this is a really, really big trunk tree. And so because the trunk is so massive, it supports a branch structure that's farther out. If this trunk, if the branches stopped where it was, to me it would look unbalanced. It would look unnatural. And so for me, I want these branches to grow at least another quite a bit out. Probably over the lip of the pot, 2, 3, 4 inches, something like that. So this tree still has quite a bit of silhouette to build. Yeah.
Wherever did you get that pine tree anyway?
I think this came from your place.
Why did I say that?
That's okay, you got it from somewhere else too, right?
That's true.
Yeah,
I believe that was one of the trees that came through Canada from Korea, ended up in the desert of California. We were down there, and that's where I got it. Okay, so.
Question on wiring.
Yep.
You put all this wiring on it, and I'm like confused a bit about wiring, about how long you leave it on. And somebody said, well, you leave it on, don't start taking it. That's kind of the part.
Yeah.
But that seems a little bit too late for me. It seems like it's a damage.
It's like being on a train and someone tells you to get off at the stop before I get off.
Yeah.
And you don't see when they're getting off. So, yes, you, question,
Well, I'm curious about leaving the wire on, how long to leave it on so that it sets the branch.
Okay, question is how long do you leave the wire on so that the branch sets without also scarring the tree? All right, and the answer is it depends on the species. All right, so I mentioned before that I will almost never wire a Japanese maple, and never wire a Japanese maple without putting raffia on. Same with Princess Persimmon, Chinese hackberry. I don't know, there's half a dozen or so trees with very thin bark. Like some crab apples are that way. They have very thin bark. Others have more crusty bark. So a lot depends upon the tree that you're wiring and how fast or slow it grows. The answer to your question is you can, if you look very closely at the branches or twigs, you will see that they are starting to bump up around the wire. So the wire hasn't dug in so much that it's kind of dimpled or starting to create a little channel there. That's the indication you have to remove the wire. Right, if you're waiting for it to kind of mound up around there, you waited a couple of months too long. Okay? Yeah? You want to unwire that branch and look at every other branch to see if those also require. So whenever you're wiring the places that you bend the most, that's where it's most likely to bite in, right? If you put the most pressure on it, the tree is going to try to heal itself because it'll have little micro tears and things like that. It'll likely callus a little bit more there, more likely to bite in there. So if it's biting in there, look at other places where you've done a substantial bend to see whether it's starting to bite in as well. If it's not biting in, then you can let it go a little bit longer, but now you're kind of aware that you have to check it more frequently. I'm sorry, I thought someone else was asking the question. I couldn't see your mouth move. Ask it again. Do I rewire?
So taking the wire off of the start, if I know it, do you go back and rewire and set it?
No.
You're going to leave it off of that.
Yes. If it's starting to bite in all over the place, I'll remove all the wire and let it rest for a few months or a season, and then rewire it. So this tree, I took wire off nearly 2 months ago. And so it just kind of rested. Now I'm ready to reshape it. There's another question? Yep. How to protect the trees during the winter? Okay. Everybody does it depending upon the resources they have available. So what I do is my best trees I bring into the garage. They're all deciduous, so they don't really need much light during the winter time. Maybe they don't need any light during the winter time, I don't know. So that's what I do. I build a temporary greenhouse for some of them, and others I put on the ground. And usually that's enough for as cold as it gets here. If it gets down below 20 degrees, then I might cover them with a tarp or something for a night or so.
Yeah, winter care is tricky. Using a garage or a greenhouse is the ideal solution. If you have the space. If you don't have that, just putting it on the ground like Dennis says, there's about a 7-degree difference from it being up on the bench and it being down on the ground, kind of in contact with the earth. And so there's a real nice buffer. That 7 degrees can be a lot if it's 25 degrees outside. You can have your tree freeze on the bench, and on the ground, it's still unfrozen. So yeah, just putting it on the ground. Some species are more sensitive than others. A trident maple is way more sensitive to cold than a Japanese maple. So trident maples need protection around 25 degrees. Japanese maples need protection around 18 degrees. Styrax is another one that needs quite a bit more protection. And so it kind of depends on the species. Size also matters. So shohin need a lot more protection than a really, really big tree in a really big pot. And so it kind of all just depends. But ideally, everything is in a greenhouse or a garage or some type of protection. Yeah, other questions? Yeah, the patio can be okay, but nestled into grass or gravel or something or mulch is the best to do. We're relatively lucky in Portland. Some years you could probably keep the trees on the benches all year round. But if we lived in Denver or something like that, we'd have to be a lot more careful.
I lived in Denver for a year with Bonsai. I put them underneath the house in the crawl space, and they survived. I watered them about once every 10 days, 2 weeks. It worked. I also had some in the garage. They didn't make it. It was a cold garage, separate on its own. No way to control the temperature there. It got down below 0 a few times. Denver's a tough place to grow bonsai.
All right, I'm about to move on to this styrax, so I just wanted to make a quick few comments about that.
Can I say a couple of things
Yes,
before you begin there? All right, so I'm going to start placing branches here. It's the thing that I intended to do, but since we were talking, I was able to wire a couple more branches. So as you can see from this tree here, so this is my tree as well. Notice in particular the top of the canopy or the crown of the tree. Notice how the branches grow mostly vertical. All right, in a lot of traditional bonsai, people want to have the branches grow flatter when you get to the top. You may do that with conifers, but with deciduous trees, they shouldn't flatten out at the top. They should form an irregular broom style at the top. So that's what I'm going to do to this. It already has that in part, but what I'm going to do is actually bring these a little bit closer together up at the top. And then certain things that I want to do is, sorry, I have to breathe a little bit more. What I want to, if this is not okay with people, raise your hand and I'll put it back on. All right. So what I want to do is, as I go up the tree, you can see the stick kind of aligned with the branch. I want this to get taller and taller and taller. Right? I want the angle of the branch as it goes further up the tree to increase. That's what I'm aiming for. And so when it gets to the very top, it's going to be kind of like this. Now, when I first started growing this style, I was really worried because I had seen a lot of trees with suckers that will go straight up. You don't have to worry about that if your tree is reasonably well developed, because what it's going to do is it's going to spread the energy of those suckers across 20 other branches. So as long as, if you see a sucker, you snip it back, the rest of them will tame down because you have enough branches there. So that's the plan. I'm going to move things mostly upward and somewhat out. And I'm also going to make some branches which grew a little bit too straight, irregular. One last comment. You see what these branches look like? So every branch on this tree used to look like this, long and straight. So mostly through wiring, some through clip and grow, I change the shape of the tree. Done.
All right, so I have a styrax here. This tree I got as a young tree from a guy in Illinois. He had taken a trunk, or a cutting rather, and he wired it and grew a really nice trunk. But when we got it, it had almost no branching on it. So all the branching that you'll see once I clean it up has been created by me. Styrax is a really wonderful plant. It's very similar to trident maple. Is if you're worried about time and not having enough time, this is one of the trees that develops the most quickly. Just like a trident, it's a multi-flush plant. We can defoliate it, we can cut it back several times a year, and it will reliably regrow. Styrax, however, is an alternate leaf plant. So rather than cut it back to the first pair, like I mentioned earlier, what I'm going to be doing is when I go to trim it back, I want to at least go to the second pair, because when I go to the second bud, when I go to that second bud, I'm going to at least get 2 branches that grow in the place of 1. So right now, this is what grew. If I take it back to the first bud, I get a change of movement just by making a cut. I create movement, but I don't gain any ramification. So if I want it to go this way, then I'll cut it here. If I want it to grow over towards Dennis, I'll cut it here. Broadleaf plants, at the base of every leaf, there's a bud. And so wherever you see a leaf, you can guarantee that there's going to be a bud at the base of that leaf. So I'll take my pruner, I'll cut it back to either the second or the third pair, so that depending on the direction that I want to go. So something like that. It was long. This is a young tree, so I didn't cut this at all during the growing season because I'm trying to build caliper. I'm trying to build my primary branching. It has a nice trunk, but it doesn't have much else than that. And so I let it run the whole growing season to gain some thickness. Now I'm going to cut it back to where we can start creating some beautiful movement in the branches. Questions about this before I start tackling it? Yeah. Yeah, so it's just starting to turn color. It was a real deep kind of emerald green. Now it's a really light lime kind of green. I bet in 3 or 4 days it's going to go yellow. And so because I'm making larger cuts, pruning it slightly earlier, will give it a little tiny bit of an advantage. But it's the time of year that I know that because everything else is dropping its leaves, it's not going to regrow. Other questions? All right, I'm going to start pruning this back. Dennis, tell us, what movements are you trying to create?
I'm creating irregular movements. Now, that's surprisingly difficult, because if you think about it, you go left, right, up, down, left, right, up, down. So you have to intentionally not think about how you're bending it. It's actually very simple. Let's find a branch that we don't need.
Andrew's got some. I got some.
Yes, he does. I don't need all this. I'm going to pass this around. So if you take a look at the buds on there, the buds are arranged, you might say spirally around the branch as it grows. What I'm doing is, when I wire, I want to put the wire underneath where the bud is. Because at that position, I'm going to bend it. So having the wire where I want to bend it keeps it from breaking. So in a way, the tree is telling me where it wants to bend, where the bud is, because where the bud is, it'll throw out a shoot. The shoot will aim for the light. It'll influence the direction of the branch a little bit. So that's how you can do it irregularly without thinking. Just follow where the buds are. In some cases, when you wire the wire spiral might be a little bit closer, a little bit further away. The preference is to put the wire underneath the bud. The second best preference is just above the bud. Putting it in the middle between two buds doesn't help you, because you don't want to bend there. All right, so you aim for below the bud because it's less likely to affect the bud. Putting it just above the bud is also good, but it might cause problems when you go to take the wire off. You could knock off a little branch or bud.
Yes?
Yes.
I've got a question for both of you. Since you talked about the arrangements of the buds on the plum being rather spiral, I noticed that at least on Japanese maples, the buds alternate, somewhat vertical and horizontal. So when you prune, your basic rule, like Andrew went over, is to prune back to the first pair. But would you really rather guide by your pruning the layout of those buds so that you either get it horizontal or vertical, or do you just ignore that?
I ignore it, because I know that I can always change it with the next increment coming out if I need to. I will almost always take it back to the first bud, let it resprout, and then work with whatever comes out there. I forgot to repeat your question. Did anybody miss the question that I just answered? Yes. Okay.
All right, so when I prune this back, I'm doing a couple things. I'm looking for where it started growing, so I look for that point of origin, because that's where the straightness starts. And if I'm not going to wire this tree, like I'm choosing to do this time around, by not wiring it, I can have, I only want a small portion of straightness. That portion is proportionate to if it's a shohin, that might be 1 centimeter. If it's a really large bonsai, that could be 2 inches. So this tree is going to be a medium-sized tree. It will be somewhere in between. So really, I want no more than 1 inch of straightness anywhere on this plant. Because if you look at the trunk on this tree, it has quite a bit of movement. That means the branching should have quite a bit of movement as well. And so really, I want to keep that straightness pretty minimal. So I'm doing 2 things. I'm looking for where that branch started growing. And then once I find that spot, I find a leaf and a bud growing in a direction that I want it to go while having a little bit of straightness. Does that make sense? All right. Any questions about the Cyrax? Yeah.
What if the first, up to the first internode, starts out?
Then you just have to cut it back harder. But there is a strategy. If you leave something that you don't like, it can actually help and be a benefit to you. By leaving things that we don't like and leaving a lot of them, the more density, the more twigs, the more branches this has, the smaller the internodes, the smaller the leaves it's going to have. And so oftentimes on deciduous, we have to leave a lot of problems just to get a tree like this to slow down. And then once it starts growing with small leaves, showing internodes, then we can go back in and fix some of those problems.
You need opportunities, not problems.
Right, opportunities.
What's telling you want to slow the tree down?
Yeah, when Scott asked, what's telling me we want to slow the tree down? I think this tree is kind of in the middle. We could keep going and pushing it hard. The thing is, we have a really nice trunk, but we still don't have too much besides that. I have to start to some nice branching, but I want to build my primary structure a little bit more. What I see a lot when I travel with deciduous plants in America is we have a really big trunk, but then we have tiny little twigs coming off of that, and we never have that transitionary material. And so we want to make sure that that big trunk flows into a slightly less big primary branch, and then it tapers to a secondary branch and a tertiary branch, and eventually to a twig. So what we absolutely don't want is a big trunk with like a little tiny thing coming off of it. And so that's what I gauge for when do we slow a tree down. This tree is still a young tree. It's in this plastic pot. I'm still growing it pretty hard, but it's getting to be to the point where it's going to start looking like a bonsai in the next couple of years. And once I put it in a pot, that's kind of the time that I really hit the blade time.
All right, we will abruptly transition to a break. Thank you so much. This is a great opportunity to visit our vendors, peruse their fine wares, come up and get a close look at these subjects. Stop on over at the silent auction. There's hot items over there. It has nothing to do with what I brought in my van tonight. And maybe 10 minutes. All right, and you two will still be up here working? Sounds good. Enjoy.
Yeah, so I wanted to have a short, like something from it's kind of, you take both variables. So something like this, so how do I get starting from it has a nice natural curve in it. What's it look like here, here, so I'll put this here. To get a nice, pretty good range, but it's gonna be hard to get the stuff cutting it off. Yeah. Something like this is starting to grow. Okay, just go ahead and let it go. We'll probably cover that's the maximum amount of space. Just trying to identify where it's starting to grow. Start right now. Sometimes things that are a little bit stronger. Yeah, there's quite a few of them. Cut back. Things that are kind of small, we can eat a little. They tend to be the same. They tend to be around. Yes. You know, they don't have this. So I go ahead right now and start bringing them. Yes, it's similar to what you did right now. This one's part of the way. Yeah.
I just want to make sure I understand what you're doing.
I just moved it, you know, I perfectly know it about. And I can click this up. It's just a I might, okay, so I looked where I'm going now, where, and then it's one line, it's on my screen.
But then it's like, I can't make it 100%. Because then I just have
Yeah, for some reason.
I'm just saying, this big, it's like I have no set definition. I want them all to be. So okay. That's 10 inches bigger, so I definitely want it to. Look how big it is, make the difference in our hands. For a height that's really close to 6, that seems to me like this is so fine here. That's probably not good. It's just with timing, so 50 years is going to be really hard. So those are the issues that I'm trying to address.
Are you our professional photographer?
Yeah, I'm the club. Yeah. I went into a store the other day, Refinement, on sale, right? I walked in there, I was looking for something, and I happened to glance over and see a whole wall of film. 20, 30 different kinds of film. All different brands I never heard of. Right? Plus Kodak. Yeah, that's right. No, but they still have a lot of their stores. Yeah, that's right. Yeah. Well, anyway, they still have that first store. Anyway.
This is your official 2-minute warning on the silent auction. I got a microphone, I can yell louder than you, Dane. 2 minutes until the silent auction is over.
You're in luck.
Yeah, that's fine. I think it's All right.
2 minutes, 2 minutes, and then we'll start. 2 more minutes. Right now, instead of leaving, it's an option. Yeah, there's
These are the neighbor trees. Oh, yeah. And everywhere. No, yeah, they're dumping right down here. Oh, the only thing you did is made it easier to do this. Are you fighting like this drain back? Oh, okay. I'm not opposed. Okay, no problem. Yes. The maple leaf. Okay. All right, feel free to be assertive and jump in.
All right, let's get started. You can find your seats. Dennis and I will round up the presentation. Part 2. All right. So you can see the trident, or excuse me, the styrax looks a little bit different than before. Just a recap, it's a young tree, so I let it grow more. I let it grow untouched throughout the growing season, and then now I'm cutting it back to where there's beauty. And again, that beauty is minimal straightness and more compaction. Now, a couple notes. This tree has lots of problems. There's a branch growing inside a curve. There's a reverse taper up here. However, this is a tree that it is beginning its refinement process. And if I cut off all of those problems today, I'm actually doing more harm than good. If I take this branch in the curve, if I start to address some of this reverse taper right now, it's going to keep causing the tree to be strong, strong, strong. And I want to start to create, like Scott mentioned, I want to start transitioning this to be a bonsai rather than a pre-bonsai. And so I'm going to leave those problems for now, because those problems are helping contribute this have a more appropriate energy that we want. The other thing is that density is going to distribute my growth. And so if I just keep cutting this back, it's going to be thin, 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 and I'm never going to gain any momentum. So cutting it back too much, you're just kind of shooting yourself in the foot. You're never allowing it to progress. So sometimes on a deciduous plant, we have to leave those problems, leave the branch inside the curve, leave the reverse taper so that we slow it down. And then once we get more appropriate growth, we can replace some of those problems a few years down the road with other branches and not cause it to be too vigorous. So that's where we're at with the styrax. This tree, yeah, question.
Just one quick question. When you say you want to address the reverse taper at some point, how do you do that?
Yeah, so how do we address this reverse taper? Was that the question? Yeah, so once this starts getting more density, once I gain some momentum on the rest of the design, I'll start to attack this, maybe branch by branch. So I'll cut off maybe a quarter of my problems one year, then the next year I cut off another quarter of my problems, and I slowly transition it to being what I ultimately want. If I cut off 100% of my problems today, I'm just going to keep fighting this tree. It's going to make the tree too strong, and then I'm going to end up creating more problems. And so by leaving some of them for now, they're going to work at my advantage to help slow the tree down and then I can eventually replace them. This is how you develop bonsai really rapidly. You could certainly cut off all your problems today, but that's going to take you 30 years to create a tree that I'll create in 10 years. Other questions?
It took me 30 years to create that tree.
Yeah, let's talk about that tree. We didn't mention, this is the tree that won Best Deciduous at the US National Show. Let's get that as a round of applause. It's a beautiful tree. This was the second time it was at the National Show?
Yes.
Is that right? Yeah, and it came home with the top Deciduous prize, so congrats to Dennis. Can you tell us a little bit about it?
I was not lying when I said it's taken me 30 years. I got the tree roughly 30 years ago, plus or minus 2. I got it as a 5-gallon nursery can, and it was about maybe 3/4 of an inch diameter, 1 inch diameter maybe at that time. I envisioned the tree at that time as you now see it. It's the only time I've ever done that in bonsai. But I imagined it as this grand, towering, sort of commanding tree, protective tree. And I did with that tree kind of what I'm doing with this tree. I took the branches after I cut them back and got the second flush that had smaller nodes. I took those branches and wired them out to the perimeter of the tree. So within the first 4 or 5 years, it was formed essentially as you see it now. And then it took another 20 years to grow into. So you can take young branches kind of like this and form or style the tree with them, but they don't necessarily give you an old appearance. That comes with time and also pinching and pruning, and probably 2 additional full wirings of that tree. That's its story.
Yeah, a big difference between working with a conifer and working with deciduous is deciduous are a long-term investment. 30 years in the making, from going to Portland Nursery, getting a trunk, chopping it, and getting to a tree that wins the US National for Best Deciduous. A conifer, the best conifers, we go get a field-grown something from Telperion, we go get a Yamadori from Randy Knight, and then we come back, we sit down with 8 hours and some wire, and we can make a bonsai in a day. It's really, really exciting. And then maybe you do that one other time, it goes in a show, and it can win an award. But with deciduous, your deciduous bonsai, this is your 401k. And everything that you see that I did on these trees that Dennis is doing on this one, it's just one contribution. It's throwing $100 into your 401k. And the art in deciduous bonsai is not what I do today, but doing it consecutively for year after year after year, that's what builds the result. Just like your 401k, you get, you build off on your interests, and your growth is exponential. So you can think of deciduous bonsai as this long-term investment. The nice thing about it is you can start with something really humble. You don't have to go buy a $2,000 Yamadori. You can start with a $50 tree from Portland Nursery. This tree was started as a cutting that was wired, but you can grow something really special from a really kind of simple start.
Scott wanted me to mention why it is I'm wiring this rather than doing clip and grow. So in part, I answered it by explaining how I styled this tree. That when you wire, you can see the full image that you have of the tree. So when I'm done with this, I can see the main structure really well. Now, it'll still take time to fill in, and I may have to prune it back to get it to bud more closer to the trunk. But the advantage for me is I can see whether the vision works or not, whether some other arrangement of the branches might be required because there's too much congestion or whatever. So you can do clip and grow, you can do wiring. It takes about the same amount of time. So to go from raw material to exhibition, natural exhibition quality takes 20 years. The best thing you should do is find someone who's done the first 10 years of work for you. It speeds things up quite a bit. Okay.
That really does help. The other thing too is, Dennis is fully wiring this tree this time. Next time he might choose to do in clip and grow. So the combination of wiring, cutting is just like what he did on the hawthorn. You said you only wired the hawthorn 2 or 3, 4 times, something like that?
Yeah.
So it's a combination of both the techniques that you're seeing up here over time that makes the result.
Right. I use the wire to set the structural shape and then clip and grow for the twigs. There's no reason to try to wire out these teeny little twigs because half the time you snap them anyway.
All right, so moving on, I'm going to start on my last tree that I brought. I always like to bring trees to the meetings that I've worked on before. And so this is a white chochabai that I had at our summer event. I think it was in July. And so the last time I touched this tree was at that event. If you were here in July, it looked like a bush. We trimmed it back to be a bonsai, and we're going to do that same thing again. Chochabai is another plant, just like trident maples or Japanese maples, that Dennis and I don't like to do a lot of wiring on. You can get a lot of nice movement and structure without having to do very much wiring. And so this tree, maybe only 10% of the branches have ever been wired, but it's mostly by clip and grow. So what I'm going to do is the same thing I did on the styrax. It's just going to look a little bit more different. Because this is an old tree or an older bonsai, I'm just going to go back and cut to the first 2 or 3 buds, something like that. This is going to be a much smaller tree. It's a chuhin, a medium-sized plant, and so I want that internode to be pretty small, about no more than 1 centimeter of straightness on this tree. So I look for where it started growing, and then I'm just going to cut it back to somewhere around 1 centimeter in straightness into a bud that's growing in a good direction. This is a tree that I've been working on for maybe 10, 12 years, something like that. It started as nursery stock. So it was a chochabai that was in a big plastic pot. It was, a big tall plant that hadn't been grown very carefully for bonsai. I reset it. I cut it back to maybe 1-inch stubs coming out of the soil. And then through this clip and grow technique with a little bit of wiring, this is the result that we got. So I'll trim it up and we'll see where it's at.
Up to me.
One more thing, I wanted to talk about the tool that I have up here. This is a really, really great tool. If you're a beginner in bonsai, there's no need to go and buy a full tool set. Something like this is just an ARS pruner. It's a nice, simple tool made in Japan, but you can get it from Portland Nursery or whatnot for 25 bucks. It's a really small investment, but you can cut branches, both small and big. You can cut wire. In my garden, I have all these types of fancy tools, but this is one that I use 90% of the time. So really, really handy little tool.
Okay. So I've been working on the top of the tree. I don't know if you see much difference or not right now, but to me, the branches that used to go out kind of flat are now more upright. This one is still somewhat flat, but it'll get more upright as well. So that's what I'm aiming for. In this section, some of these branches, like this one, are going to rise. So I have a hole here where I lost 2 or 3 branches. rather than drop branches down into that hole to fill it, I'm going to let these branches rise up. Because it's a more natural way, for me anyway, for how a tree would respond. These branches would all of a sudden have access to light that they didn't have before, and they'd start filling in the space. So that's the general strategy there. Let's see if I can actually do that.
While you're doing that, what did you treat the tree with for the fungus?
Fungicide. A fungicide that, I don't know if it said specifically for shot hole fungus, I don't think so. So it was a general purpose fungicide. So there's one aspect of this branch that I don't really care for so much. These two branches are kind of stacked. And before, they were visually crossing, so it almost looked like a little hole there. What I want to do is pull this branch up and back somewhat to fill in this space and do it without cracking. And then, if it doesn't hold, I'll use a guy wire to pull it against this trunk so that it stays somewhat in this position here. Then I'll raise this up to fill in the back space here. So I don't normally agree with John Naka that for deciduous trees that you should create them so that the birds would fly through. But in this tree, the birds will be able to fly through. Right here is their passage. And before we're all done, we're going to put up a little sign that says, birds this way. Bird crossing. Exactly. All right. Yes, sir.
Can you prune the tips of those branches at all when you're done?
Absolutely.
Okay.
Yes. So I don't know how tall or how wide this tree is going to be when I'm done, but it'll be compacted for two reasons. One, my car fits in a 38-inch tree. All right, so if I wire these things up, they'll get bent anyway. But chances are this is about the height of the tree, all that I really need. Everything else growing up, I don't really need it. So if that's the outer limit, and so you can see the outer limit on the edge is about here, So this tree is going to go like a cloud. So it will not be a triangular shape. Someone who wrote the books on bonsai decided that a triangle was a really good shape for bonsai. It is not for a deciduous tree. Anybody ever hear of a Zen koan? So it's what the Zen master asked his student to ponder, not to think about, because it's not a logical thing you can answer. So the most famous Zen koan is, what is the sound of one hand clapping? So I have a bonsai koan for you. What is a triangle? What's the shape of a triangle that has no points and no straight lines? That's your koan for tonight. Okay, so the top of this tree is actually coming together pretty well. I don't know if you can see from here on up, basically. it's got something close to the shape that I want. And we'll more after I pull this one up a little bit. So it's unusual for a tree to have branches that come back in toward the tree. But this branch does that. So that tells me that trees don't know all the rules. And it's okay when they don't know all the rules. So don't try to fix all the things that might be wrong with the tree, because it may just be on its way curving up and around and back out again. So it's not going to grow all the way in and touch this other tree, the main trunk here, because it'll get completely shadowed. But if for some reason the top part died off and it's the branch, and now that died off part is gone and it sees the sun, then that could get activated. And even though it's not growing very far inward, that might be the original way that the shoot came out. At least that's how I think of it.
All right. So I'm about 2/3 of the way done with the chochibai. You can see I turned where I've been towards you. It's starting to look like a bonsai again, which is fun. The other reason I brought this, other than that we've seen it before and I want you to see the evolution, is that this is a shrub. And with deciduous bonsai, we're working with trees, shrubs, and vines. With conifers, we mostly just work with trees. But with deciduous, we get to play with these other forms of plants. All the trees up here besides this one are trees. The styrax, the trident, the plum, the hawthorn, they're trees. So they grow taller than they do wide. And they have a very different form than a shrub. And so Dennis and I both like very natural bonsai. We like the round rather than the triangles. We like the branches that grow up rather than down, which we've been talking about. But with shrubs, they have this different form that's really fun to play with, and that's why if you have a quince, the trunks, they tend to have a lot more trunks than your tree. Trees tend to be kind of single-stemmed, or maybe they have a few things that come off of that. Shrubs have a lot of trunks. Shrubs grow wider than they do tall. Shrubs have a lot more kind of crazy, spastic, sinuous movements. And so it gives us another opportunity. If you have all trees on your branch, having something like a chochibai gives us some kind of visual relief, which is really fun. So that's how this tree's been designed. I'm going to keep working on it. I have a little bit more left to do. When you come up after the meeting and come up and take a close look, I encourage you to do that, because so much of what we're doing is kind of fine detail. But look at how much straightness I've left, and then look further back into the branch, because that's our history lesson. So if you look further back into the branch, all the way to the trunk, try and identify the straight portion. And this tree has very little of that. And so that's what makes this a really nice quince, is that it has a lot of that movement that's been built in.
So why do we not want straight portions? Because crooked looks old. Right, so we're looking for a mature tree, an old tree, in some cases an ancient tree. Those do not have a lot of straightness to them. They've suffered through winters and storms and high winds, and so they've lost pieces. They've had to resprout. They don't have much strength. If you look at most oaks or maples, especially hawthorns, which grow all convoluted, there's not much straight to them. So when I talk about making branches crooked, I want to make them look older. A straight branch, if I just let this here, you'd say, yeah, when are you going to do something with that? So we take branches that start out straight and make them look older. And that again kind of answers part of what Scott asked me before about why do I wire, because I spent a few years letting these things grow. I often let branches grow several years before I'll wire them till it gets enough material on it to make it interesting. Right? Because if I try to wire it each little bit that comes out each year, that wouldn't work very well. So I'm wiring things that are maybe 2 or 3 years old, that are still fairly small. So I pinch them repeatedly so that they don't usually grow this long. Again, this was to make the tree healthier. But when it gets to be 6 inches or so, 3 years worth of growth maybe, then it's worthwhile going through and wiring that. So that 6 inches may have 12 or so nodes on it, right? I don't necessarily need a branch from each of those nodes. If I did the clip and grow, it may take twice as long to get to that point. So wiring is a little bit of a shortcut for clip and grow. Now, is it better to do wiring than clip and grow? Probably not. But clip and grow just takes longer. So part of what we do is find compromises for the slow speed that this might take versus something that might be accomplishable 5 years quicker. So wiring is one of those things. The thing about wiring is you don't want to screw it up, scar the tree, have to cut it off and start over. So that's why I say on things that have a very thin bark, like Japanese maples, do not wire unless you wrap the bark. Princess persimmon, wrap the bark. So I made a mistake with Princess persimmon this past fall, or past year. I wired it, but I wrapped the wire with paper tape. And I thought that would be sufficient protection. It is not. So all tape does is it makes a thicker piece of wire in effect. Right? It doesn't give you the same kind of cushioning that raffia does, because raffia spreads the force across several different fibers. So it's harder for that piece of wire to bite in because the force is spread. So that's why I encourage you to use something like raffia rather than tape, at least tape on the wire. Yeah.
When you're using raffia to do a deciduous and you wrap it, do you wrap it the same way you do the wire? So if you have buds coming out, you're not covering up buds.
I'm going to have you repeat the question because I wasn't sure about same way you do the wire.
Well,
in the same direction?
Yeah, well, you mentioned that you need to be careful about the buds.
Yeah.
And where the shoots might come out. And you have to make sure you don't cover those up with raffia too, right?
Yes.
Right, wiring it.
Okay, so that's kind of a complex question. If you're wiring, and I suggest you put raffia on branches that have very thin bark. What do you do? 2 things about the buds that might be there, because you probably don't want to cover those up because that makes it harder for them to pop out. And do you go in the same direction as with the raffia as you do the wire, or the opposite direction? Now, this may be controversial. I'll take the second one first. I typically will go in the opposite direction with the wire. So if I'm wiring clockwise, I'll put the raffia on counterclockwise. So that way the wire is spanning the raffia like this. Not quite perpendicular, but let's call it orthogonal. I always like that word. I'm not sure what it means, but I like it. So what it does is, if you have raffia and you're running the wire across the raffia this way, the raffia is spreading the force of the wire, so it's not going to bite in very quickly. If you put the raffia running parallel to the wire running parallel to the raffia, there's the chance that that wire is going to go around that same piece of raffia the whole way up. Now, I say there's a chance, but I've done it. I wired a wisteria with raffia same direction as the wire, and then I twisted the tree because I wanted to give it some more curve. Ask me why it's wrong to twist the tree later. So I wired it, raffia, the wire bit in on that one strand of raffia. I twisted it, seemed to be working. I twisted a little bit more, seemed to be working. I twisted a third time and it snapped off because the wire tightened itself around that one strand, tightened itself around on that one piece of raffia, and I snapped the head of the wisteria off. That's why I go the opposite direction now.
Yeah, I've been holding up. Go for it.
Thank you. Okay, so I'm open for taking payments now. If you're paying via Venmo or via check, if you choose to pay by Venmo, if you could put Bonsai and your member number in the payment reason, that will help me keep track of who's here. Thank you.
Thank you. Question, yeah. For Dennis.
Oh, these are both now pots. Now isn't here tonight, is he? Okay. Yes, he created this pot especially for this tree. Yeah, we talked about it, about the size, the style, and then I let him figure out the rest. And turned out pretty well. Yeah.
What color was your foliage at the show? Was it this color?
It was green starting to yellow. So it did not, the pot was designed for this time of year, for when it's in full color. But it apparently did not, was not treated as a detriment when it had just regular green foliage on it. The interesting thing was earlier in the year, when we looked at it, the pot looked really heavy and dark. But for some reason, well, maybe because then we put moss on, and I pulled some leaves off because I removed all the damaged leaves. All of a sudden more light came in, the green lit it up, and looks beautiful. Anyway, so both that one and this one are from now the potter.
If you go back to the previous question about hiding the buds with the raffia.
Oh, okay, I didn't answer that part, did I? Yes, I'll get to that one in just a sec. All right, so if you're wrapping with raffia, what do you do about buds? You can wrap around the bud. And that is, if I see a little bud popping up, I'll put the raffia around it, but not over it. So you can still see the bud on the edge of the raffia. And that alerts me to what I need to look out for. Now, if they're completely dormant buds and very small, that's harder to do. I don't have a good answer for it then. Okay, now the other question was, oh, yes, that's what we did with this tree. So I didn't give you the full story of this. Originally, way back when, before I knew anything about bonsai, I styled this tree, and this branch came out like this, and this low branch here came out like this. And and most of the rest of the branches were horizontal. It was the ugliest thing I'd ever done. And then Dave the Goat stayed with us one time when he was doing a presentation for East Bay Bonsai Society, and I asked them to help with this tree. And what we did was we wrapped the branch, put big copper wire against it, and then wrapped that around it, or raffiated that to it, and then wire around that. And then with both of us working, we bent branches that were, I don't know, 1/2 inch, 3/4 of an inch. And both of us had to actually work it. And then we used guy wires to hold it up and into place. So both of these branches started out horizontal, and they were very close to in alignment with each other. So we splayed them out, brought them up. And yes, it can be done. It is a lot of work, but if you need to move a big branch, that's one possibility. Okay? More questions, more answers.
I kind of have a complicated question.
Go for it.
I'm gonna have to kind of point out some things. So you have smaller internodes here. You have this longer branch here that you said only has 1, 2, 3.
Yep.
And its first year of growth, would it be a good idea to stop it growing bigger and longer, so you have a branch like this with more internodes, and then the following year you let the longest branch out here grow longer, so you accumulate more internodes. Is that a fair idea?
You could. So the question is, do we want to do some things to get more compact internodes on this little branch, essentially? And you don't really need to, because this branch is ultimately going to be out to here. And so if I have a few open spaces that close into the tree, it's not going to be too much of a detriment. If this was a shohin, that would be a really bad thing. The other thing is I could always thread graft this. So I could take this branch, I can loop it through, and I can put it right, to where I want it. And so I could get a branch wherever I want it fairly easily. And so it's not too big of an issue. What I'm going for on this tree is speed, and so to develop it out where I want it to go, it's not going to be it's not going to cause any problems back in towards the plant. But you certainly could. I think it'd just be more work than is required. Other questions? Yeah. On this tree? Yeah, so question, do we want to open this up to see more of the base? I don't think so. This is getting to be the appropriate amount of density that I feel for a deciduous plant. The time that we appreciate deciduous is in the winter time, right? That's our maximum level of appreciation. And so in the winter, all the leaves are going to drop and we're going to be able to see everything very clearly. And so that's how we tend to design our deciduous plants. The John Naka rule, having a bird fly through this would destroy all of this beautiful work. It would make it look like a bonsai rather than an actual deciduous plant, I think. And so the problem with the old chochibai or the old quince is that it can be just too regular. And so in the future, what we might want to do is go in and remove things so that it looks a little older, but we do that very selectively. With this plant, we kind of have to give it a chance to be young. This is only 10 years into its development, and so I can certainly go and cut out a lot of things now, but I tend to take the slower approach and let time kind of decide some of those things. But the density will be totally fine once all these leaves drop and we can see everything very clearly. Other questions?
What is he doing cutting off all those things? Oh. So you asked if I'm going to leave these long. And the answer is no. now removing the parts that I definitely don't need. My hope was that it would be fully wired and shaped by now, but maybe I'll bring it back again sometime, another year or so. We'll get to see what it looks like. So the only one that I am not touching is this one. The reason is it's weak. And I would dearly love to have something grow in here. But, another pearl of wisdom. So from the side, you can see how long this one is. That's intentional for two reasons. One, I wanted more strength in this branch. And when it came out strong, I was thinking that I could use it for fed grafting back into here if I needed to. The other thing is, can you see this teeny little branch right here? I've been the one in front. I've been waiting for about 4 or 5 years for that thing to take off. And it does, and then it dies back. So my light bulb that went off was a branch needs to see the sun. So the branch needs to find its way to the edge of the canopy in order to see the sun. Or you have to create a hole through the tree so that branch can see the sun. Because if it doesn't see the sun, it's not going to grow. So the reason I left this on was so it could see the sun more and grow stronger. What I really care about are these shoots between here and here. This is all sacrifice. And the only reason it's there is to keep the other part alive so that maybe next year it's the one that takes off. So I'll prune this back in springtime to here or somewhere close, somewhere at the edge of the canopy, but still getting sunshine.
You say it's not strong, does that mean it just didn't have very many buds this spring? Or is it no buds set?
It's just a very weak branch. This is the only shoot coming off of it. So it used to be, the branch used to fill in the space and died back. So this tree, either because of shottle fungus or because of root problems, had dieback all along here. And since that time, only a little shoot came from this front one here, and only that one long one came from there. So what I would love is for this whole thing to grow fuller, but it's taking its time. So all I have right now is this, and I'll slowly cut it back in order to help push those lower down buds. And if I get enough growth and this thing takes off, then I'll remove it and regrow it from the piece that I like. Bucky?
All right, so we're going to start to wrap things up. I'll let Dennis get a little bit more work done. While he's doing that, I wanted to talk just a little bit about winter care and what we do with our deciduous trees in the winter. Because now that they're dropping their leaves, now that you're wiring them and you're pruning them right now, what do we do after that until they start growing, until repotting? The answer is really not much. When trees are dormant, they're less active. We don't want to do a lot of pruning, like we said, for the bleeding. We don't want to do a lot of wiring because any little crack is going to cause damage and cause that branch to die. And so we don't like doing very much during the dormant period. What can you do? You can do a few things. You can take your tree that you just wired or that you pruned back, put it in front of a clean white wall, and take a photo of it. And that's your yearly report card. If you do that every year, take your silhouette photograph when it's in its bare branches, that's a really, really good key indicator for you. That tells you is, you know, what I did in 2017, 18, 19, is this on a good trajectory? Do I need to change my techniques? Do I need to alter my path? And so that's a really, really good way to keep track of your deciduous bonsai from year to year. Another thing you can do is if you have branches like this one that are weak, you could say, I want to let that grow next year. I might put a little marker on that or something so that I know not to cut it. So you could take a pipe cleaner or whatever your system might be, mark it somehow so that next year when this thing is full of leaves and you go to trim it for the first time, you don't cut off something that you accidentally want to grow.
Oh, that never happens.
Or conversely, you could do the opposite. If you see a branch on here that if it's the middle of winter, you don't want to cut it back right now. But if you see a branch that needs to go that you want to cut back or cut off, you can mark that too, so that in the wintertime when it's full, or in the summertime when it's full of leaves, you can make that cut at a more appropriate time. Something else you can do with your deciduous plants in winter is a dormant spray. Lime sulfur is the traditional spray. What I do is I cover the pots with a garbage bag or something that I cut a slit in. I take a diluted lime sulfur, typically 1 part lime sulfur to 20 or 25 parts water. You spray the tree. You make sure not to get any in the root system. You take that bag off and then you use a paintbrush to paint the nabari or the surface roots. And that's a way to kill fungal spores that you might have on the plant. It also lightens the branches a little bit. In Japan, they do this a lot. They use a stronger or a less strong dilution, so more lime sulfur, and it gets the plants looking kind of very white. And you can kind of do it to your taste. If you like that look, you can do that. If you like them to look a little bit more natural, you can use a stronger dilution. But that it's an aesthetic thing to make the plants look older, as well as a horticultural thing to kill the fungal spores. Question? Yeah, so I take some type of plastic, cover the surface of the pot so that I don't get any of that lime sulfur dripping into the roots. And then I take that off, and then anything that was covered with the plastic, like our nabari or surface roots, I use a paintbrush and paint the surface roots.
I didn't realize you put the lime sulfur at that strength on the live.
Yeah, we do it on the bare branches in the winter. So we don't want it dripping into the root system, but it's you know, it covers the whole rest of the plant. All right. Let's do one more question if we have it. I'm going to give Dennis some final thoughts. Thanks everybody for coming out tonight. If you have any questions about the trees, come up, take a look at what we did a little bit closer, because all of the work that we're doing is mostly in the detail. But yeah, I'll leave it with Dennis.
I have no final thoughts.
We will see you next month. We are going to meet the 4th Tuesday of November. We'll do the same protocols that we've had in place for this month. Thank you for working with us with that, and we'll see you in November.
All right, now we do the usual song and dance of resetting the room. The chairs probably all stay. There's 7 round tables that come out, and the chairs go around them, 6 each.
Also, if you won items at the auction, we are now open for credit card payments. If you are a seller, I have a check for you for the items that were sold tonight. Thank you.